Yeah.
So we're in Genesis 41, 41 today. And it's another one that's actually pretty short. If I would have done a lot of forethought, I would have joined Genesis 40 and 41 together. They're both very similar in theme. They flow right along with one another.
Is it Joseph?
Yes. Yeah, it's him getting out of jail. So yeah, we've been chronicling the life of Joseph as of late. Again, bit of recap. Last time, 2 weeks ago, it was he was in jail. You had the chief cupbearer, or butler in this translation, had the dream along with the chief baker. He prophesied, well, this is the interpretation. And, you know, it came to pass. Joseph said, please remember me. He wasn't remembered. But now we're reaching the point where Pharaoh's going to have some dreams and no one's going to be able to answer. We also did take a small discourse on dreams, and we might recap some of that because I think it's pretty relevant, because there are just so many ways that people can get tangled up in all kinds of things these days. But to get started, we're going to go chapter 41, beginning in verse 1. Then it came to pass that at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine and looking fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Now, one of the issues with working with chapters with dreams and their interpretations is I can't really make a bunch of commentary here because, well, it's going to be explained outright, which is why this chapter is probably going to go short like last time. But there is one thing that I found of note. There's rabbinic commentary that mentions that when it says Pharaoh had a dream and he stood by the river, it was literally that he stood over the river. And they're like, you know, this contrasts the Egyptian thought, or the pagan thought, with the thought of the Israelites, or people who serve the one true God. They saw, because the Nile was viewed very much, you know, it was basically deified. It was the source of their life for Egypt. And so Pharaoh standing over it shows his position as being over the gods and one of them. Whereas when you're talking about faith to the true God, we're very obviously subservient to him. He's the creator, we're the creature. And I thought that commentary was very worth bringing out. Because it does kind of set a distinction in the mindset. But I'm going to continue in verse 9. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody with the house of the captain of the guard. Both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass that as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he restored me to my office, and he hanged him. So I think he wasn't saying that he was the one that restored, but literally that this was his interpretation. He did, you know.
I was restored.
Yeah, well, Pharaoh was the one who actually restored it, but if you're saying that, like, someone made the claim that this was going to happen, it was like, hey, he made this claim, so he restored me, and he hanged him according to the interpretation. And then, according to the interpretation, is exactly how it played out.
In other words, things turned out like Joseph predicted.
Exactly. In short, things turned out exactly like he predicted. And then something that I've been kind of mentioning, because I've been following the titles as we've gone along, because it mentions the captain of the guard again. And again, there was actually a footnote in one of the study Bibles I was using that points out, as I've been trying to point out the entire time, Potiphar was referred to as the captain of the guard. So I was unsure whether, and I had mentioned, let's keep it in our minds, whether it was the captain of the guard in totality, which would have been Potiphar, or whether it was the captain of the guard, just over that one prison. Now, I can see why they would stop saying Potiphar and just use the title for him, because at this point, if you say, well, Potiphar has him put in jail, and you continue using, well, he served Potiphar, then it kind of throws a little bit of confusion into the narrative.
Wasn't Joseph a servant of the warden of the prison?
Yes,
the warden put him in charge of the prison.
Yes, the term typically used is the captain of the guard. And when you first find out, in chapter 39, the first verse, it says, "And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard."
Oh.
And so that was Potiphar's title. So in some sense, he's still been serving Potiphar this entire time, which is really interesting to me. Okay. But yeah, so that was just something that was extremely interesting to me, and I wanted to bring that out, that there was actually some commentaries.
Melanie had a comment.
Yes.
I guess from a previous teaching on that verse 12, mine says a Hebrew youth was there with us, a servant of the chief steward. And the comment that I have on here is when this guy is talking about Joseph, he downplays who Joseph really is. Like, it was a Hebrew youth, nobody special, just this guy.
Yeah, that's true. He's not pointing out that, oh yeah, this guy was in charge of everything there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I had missed. Thanks. Okay. Oh, I turned the page on myself. There we go. That's why I couldn't find my position. All right, so verse 14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is none who can interpret it. But I have heard it of you, that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me, but God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And so again, we have just like with the chief butler or the cupbearer and the baker. First and foremost, he gives credit to God. I'm a vessel. I can't do anything. God can give an interpretation. And he already assumes that this is going to be something good, and probably prophetic insight, because he says, we'll give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Or it could simply be that he's going to give Pharaoh peace, as in, well, now at least you know what the dream is. Even if it's bad news, at least you know. Both can be a word of peace, because even if something's bad going to happen, if something is bad going to happen, having time to mentally prepare for it can bring a bit of peace in it.
The JPS says, not I. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare.
Right.
Interesting. That's good. All right, so verse 17. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat. They fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. Such ugliness I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. All the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them up, for they were just as ugly at the beginning. So I awoke. And so here's actually a bit more detail that we didn't get before. They didn't just eat them, they ate them, and it wasn't sustenance to them at all. They remained exactly the same, very gaunt.
Okay.
Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered and thin and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it for me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty blighted heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come through all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will deplete the land, so the plenty will not be known in the land, because the famine following it. For it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, because this thing is established by God, and he will shortly bring it to pass." All right. And so we have that final little detail that the cows, they ate the other cows and they didn't change. They remained gaunt. And that seems to come through here in the the famine's going to be so severe that you won't remember the times of plenty. You'll see no change.
Wow.
And very often we do that. We get into troubled times, and so often we forget how good we've had it.
Yep.
We were actually talking about that earlier. Be thankful for what you have. And it says, this famine's going to be so severe that the times of plenty, that the fact that it was just so overabundant during this time to be able to set aside, is almost going to be forgotten. It's not even going to remember. You're just going to think of how miserable things are right now.
Wow.
So verse 33. "Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and let him over the land. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers to the land, to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming up, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall serve as a reserve for the land in 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine." And so here he says, take 1/5, take 20% of it and put it aside. And that sounds like a lot. And it is a lot when you're talking about, this is what we normally have, let's take 1/5 of that and put it aside. But then also you got to think, you're setting stuff aside for 7 years. Some of it's going to spoil. Some of it you're going to have to reserve to plant. And so out of that 20%, rough estimate, there's no way I can actually nail this down, but half of it is accounted for as being waste and seed. And so you're really only working with about half of what you're setting aside to be able to preserve the nation with food. So it's really not that much, when you really think about it. Stuart.
I worked for a company in Pasco, Washington. We built potato storage sheds. And we called it Suberizer. What that means is a dormant state, and it would blow the mist onto the potatoes at 33 degrees, and those potatoes would be preserved until the spring, and they wouldn't sprout up or anything like that. The potatoes would be perfectly normal in the spring when they came to pick them up. So
cool.
That's really cool. I don't think they had that technology, but that is really cool. Don't underestimate. That's true too.
33-degree mist goes over in the entire thing, and none of the potatoes sprout.
Just 1 degree above freezing.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Well, when the first American settlers came to America, the first thing they did was build a brew house for beer. Because
Yeah.
so much of the grain got eaten by rats or molded that the best way to store the calories was as beer.
I think that's a wonderful idea.
As long as it's nice and cold.
Well, and one of the things, because you did mention the cold, and it's like I don't think they would quite have that technology, but we do know that they had ways. That there were mentions of people in the desert that would, because they knew about the strong east wind that would come through, and they lived in a valley, and they would dig these trenches, and the valley would start to compress some of the strong wind that came through. And so at night, when the temperature dropped radically, they would also dig these trenches and they'd fill it with water. And when the east wind came through and it was just funneled through this valley and then funneled through their little system that they had dug out, it would freeze the water. And so then you'd bring it down into lower areas and you'd have slight refrigeration, in the middle of the desert. And so it's one of those things that, and then they've got these clay pots that they make, and you set a clay pot within a clay pot, and the outside of the outer pot is filled with sand. You pour water in it, and as the water evaporates, it cools and preserves whatever's in that center pot.
Oh, wow.
So we don't, they probably did have some sort of extra technology to help aid this, but. Yes, Kathy.
The other thing that works with grains is bay leaves. I've been able to keep grains for 5 or 10 years, just putting them in a bucket with layers of bay leaves.
Oh,
Yeah, so
wow.
like there's a lot of
So
ways.
there's a lot of potential stuff.
Yeah,
Keeps bugs out.
but it is interesting. Like I said, the 20% it does include.
Interesting.
It does include leaving plenty aside for waste and plenty aside for reseeding, which really, let's face it, is one of the most important parts. What good is it to get through the famine and eat all of your seed crop and then not be able to get started back up again?
And you've got to remember that they probably wouldn't believe that they were going to have famine every year, and they would be using part of that to plant every year anyway, unless Pharaoh was smart enough to say, don't plant.
Well, I think that's one of the entire points behind this. Pharaoh is 100% behind this. I think it's why, in a moment, he exalts Joseph to the status he does.
Right.
Because, remember, the Egyptians viewed Pharaoh as a god.
Yeah.
They thought that he was Horus, son of Ra. They viewed him as a god. His word was law. He says, you don't plant this year, you don't plant this year. It's a word from God.
Yes.
By their reckoning. And in this case, well, the you don't plant, well, it wasn't, but, there are 7 years of famine was a word from the true God.
Notice Joseph's humility too. When Joseph gave Pharaoh advice about the famine, he didn't say, "Hey Pharaoh, appoint me, I'm your guy."
Yes, that was actually something I was going to bring up before going on a rabbit trail about quantities and preservation means. But yes, exactly that. He says, look, find someone. This is what's going to happen. I was able to answer. Just find whoever you think is best qualified. Because I can mention what's going to happen doesn't mean that I can solve the problem.
Yeah, right.
So you just find someone who can fix this.
Yeah.
Find a wise and discerning man. So verse 37.
Translation says, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?
Yeah, but Pharaoh appointed him, he didn't appoint himself.
Yeah, and we haven't read that verse yet.
Oh,
So verse 37. So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find one such as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? So, but that he points out that, we're not going to be able to find someone like this. He was able to interpret the dreams. And not only did he interpret the dream, he's like, this is what's going to happen. Here's a solution. It's one of those things, if you're going to complain about a problem, bring a solution. And so he at least had part of a solution, and he's like, you know what? It's your idea. You're part of the solution.
Go with it.
Yeah, go with it. You manage this. We're not going to be able to find anyone because he's already given credit to God about this. I'm not the one giving you the answer. So the solution likely also came from God. And so in this, God is receiving all of the glory. He doesn't see it as just his idea.
Right.
He's saying, you have the Spirit of God in you.
How different that was from when he was a 17-year-old kid telling his brothers, "Oh, look how much better than I am than you. Look at all the dreams I had and how you bowed down to me."
He grew up.
Yeah, he grew up.
Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you in all of this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house and over all my people, my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took the signet off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and he cried out before him, "Bow the knee." Then he set him over all the land of Egypt. Now it's important to note here, because it mentions, bow the knee, and we constantly talk about messengers of God don't let people bow. And here's the issue. It was a matter of stately authority. It was not a matter of worship.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that's something very worthy to point out. I'll get to you in just a moment, Jim.
Yes, sir.
The other thing is that he gave him the signet ring, and we spoke about that with the event with Judah and Tamar. This literally is like someone giving you their ID and credit card and saying, whatever you need. At this point, he has all the legal right to make any sort of transactions in Pharaoh's name. This is a major, this is a major thing to hand someone a signet ring. Jim.
Yes. You see the red on those candles? They used to use red wax, a special kind of wax, and they would use a signet ring in order to make an official document official.
Yeah, I don't know when
That's
the
what that
when the
was.
wax started, but we
I
know
don't
that
know
they
when
used
the
to
wax
use
was, but that
clay
signet
as
ring,
well. Yeah,
I'm sure it
that's
had that same kind of significance.
it is. It was exactly that. That we know for a fact they used clay. In fact, we found. I believe it was Isaiah's and Hezekiah's signet, their stamps. I can't remember the term for them off there. It's something Adula, but we've actually found their stamps.
How come that wasn't on the front page of the newspaper?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Not
Huh?
sure how long ago it was.
And they were close together. I could go off on a rant on that, but I'm gonna gonna dial it back in and continue with verse 44. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his head or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Panaah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. On is a city, not a god, just so you're aware, but she was the daughter of a priest, and her name actually means one who belongs to Neith, who was the goddess of the river Nile.
What did what did Joseph's name that Pharaoh gave him mean?
The God speaks and lives.
Oh, okay.
I was like, that was something that I didn't write down, but I actually got it out of this commentary. So I was like, wait, that's right. Okay. So verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. Now in 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food in the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. Now one of the things also, notice he didn't set up some massive infrastructure thing to bring it all to the capital It's just no, wherever you grew it, you had the silos right there in that city, you know, which, yeah, is great. You know, you would have had representatives at each one of these areas distributing things, because they were stored, you know, in the cities that surrounded them, which is something I didn't catch before. I had always thought, okay, they built this one big storehouse, and that's the way it's always shown too. You know, you see the movie, oh, we're going to make these silos, and here it is. But, you know, it actually mentions here that, yeah, they had these set up in every city where the fields were. And it just constantly surprises me that, like, every time you read Scripture, you find something new that stands out.
Well, then the people in each city had food, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Verse 50, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of the famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the first one Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And he named the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And so again, this goes to show it wasn't some major infrastructure thing leading to one storehouse. Just the entire country, you know, had food. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Egypt for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do it." The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was so severe in all the lands. And that finishes out our chapter. And now we're going to get go ahead.
So also, if you think about it, if you put everything in one spot and something happened, you lost everything.
Everything, yeah. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Colloquial saying. But yeah, so that'll actually end up this chapter. We'll pick this up in 2 weeks.